Peace is possible. Peace is necessary. Peace takes work. Peace is a way of life. Peace is you because you have power. Welcome to the Peace is Power podcast with Dr. Janae Avon Harris. And remember, while these podcasts can be helpful in your journey, they are not intended to replace formal counseling and therapy. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Janae Avon Harris here. Welcome to episode 2 of the Peace is Power podcast. I am so excited to introduce this episode. I have the amazing Rev.Dr. Nikia S. Robert. You know, as I think about this podcast, I think about times where I will be able to share some expertise that I have. Share some experiences that I have. I think about times where I will be able to kind of co-facilitate discussions and host a space where we kind of dialogue together. And then there are times when I am just all the way a student. And that is the episode today. I am all the way a student, here to learn, here to glean information. And I can't think of a better person. She is a super scholar, a preacher, and just an all-around amazing person. So here we are to learn about what abolition means, how it intersects with our faith, how do systems impact the way in which we kind of practice our faith, but also how we think about social justice. And so I'm excited to learn. I hope you're excited to learn. And y'all, I think you're going to learn some things, and I think you're going to be encouraged. All right. So here we go. Peace is Power Podcast, Abolition and Faith, Episode 2, featuring Reverend Dr. Nikia S. Robert. Hey, everybody. I'm so excited. Welcome to Episode 2. Today, I am joined by Reverend Dr. Nikia Robert. I'm so excited about this particular podcast. You know, as I approach each of the episodes, I think about it from different perspectives. So in some topics, I feel like I may have some expertise to contribute. Some topics I imagine just being a co-facilitator of a discussion. And then there are some topics and that I really am a student. And so today I am a student. And actually, Dr. Nikia, I was thinking about when I text you one day and I was like, hey, I really want to learn more about what you're doing. And so I feel like this is us having that conversation just to a wider audience, right? So
Yes.
I'm really, really excited. And so we're going to jump right in. And I'm going to ask Dr. Nikia to introduce herself and tell us what you feel like is important for us to know about you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Janae, for having me on your podcast. It is an honor. And I just want to shout out the work that you do that is so meaningful in advancing these conversations at the intersections of mental health and faith. So thank you for your expertise in holding space for us to have this conversation. I'm extremely grateful to you and to your listeners. I am Reverend Dr. Nikia Smith Robert. I am the executive director of Abolitionist Sanctuary, which is a nonprofit organization that trains faith-based communities and civic organizations and educational institutions on how to organize against the moral crisis of mass incarceration and the criminalization of impoverished Black motherhood. Our vision is to build a faith-based abolitionist movement. I'm also a professor in a liberal arts college where I teach religious studies with a focus on mass incarceration or critical carceral studies, public policy, ethics, and theology. I'm also a womanist theological ethicist, and so my research focuses on the criminalization of poor Black mothers' survival strategies. It emerges from my own personal experience growing up poor to a Black mother in Harlem, New York, who gave birth to my brother at the age of 15, and we watched her do her best to provide for us against unjust social conditions. And it made me think about the ways in which some poor Black mothers have to make really hard choices out of desperation in order to provide for their children and meet their basic needs. And sometimes that means breaking rules and breaking laws. And so my research looks to reframe the way we think about Black women's lawbreaking as not a source of criminality, but in fact a source of moral integrity. And that rather than blame people's individual agency, we in fact interrogate the social structures that make it nearly impossible for people to follow rules and survive. So that's my research. When I'm not teaching and leading a nonprofit organization, I'm also an ordained clergy person. I'm ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church as an itinerant elder, and I am a mother of three and a wife of nearly 15 years. I'm happy to be here.
First, let's just pause. I am so impressed by the resume, and you do it all in such a way that doesn't seem not attainable. That seems very real, but also very aspirational. So I appreciate how you just model the ways in which you navigate all those roles.
Thank
Sometimes people are looking, and we don't like. I feel like you can mentor people from afar, and so I definitely feel like you are a mentor in those areas to me. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, thank you, and likewise, I am walking in your footsteps, and we're each standing on each other's shoulders, if you will, because you have that nice tenured position that I aspire to. So, thank you for your writing, your research, your scholarship, because you're doing it, sis.
So much of what you said like interests me, and I want to go back to the word abolition because, to be very honest, I think the last time I remember hearing abolition was like growing up in social studies class. I remember talking about abolitionists, but I want to hear from you. What does abolition mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. That's a pretty dope school that you went to when if you were hearing abolition then, and it really speaks to the fact that abolition is not a new phenomenon, right? And so, but we're happy to see that it's gaining momentum in the more mainstream discourse within our nation and in our world. For me, abolition really is best described or defined according to these three R's. And I guess I like using alliterations because I'm a preacher, but it's a good learning device too. The three R's is to restore harms, repair relationships, and rebuild more just and equitable systems. So to restore, repair, and rebuild. For me, that really encompasses the core tenets of abolition. And within my own work and ethic of abolition, it is really achieved by applying five virtues. And those are five C's. There's those alliterations again, right? Compassion, care, creativity, courage, and community. I believe that if we were to apply those five values, that it would achieve abolition as a lifestyle in everything that we do. So abolition isn't just to abolish or dismantle prisons, right? We can talk about prison abolition, and Ruthie Gilmore and so many others, Marion Kaba and other leaders are really leading that discussion about prison abolition. And what Ruthie Gilmore says is that abolition isn't just a negative project of tearing something down, but it's also a positive project of building things up. So abolition really focuses us to create, right? And that's one of the virtues, one of the C's, the five C's, to create. How do we imagine something new, an alternative to the injustices that uphold our the carceral state, right? So how do we create and imagine a new world? And so abolition is also moving us away from punitive responses. So not just that we don't rely on prisons and policing and surveillance and systems of control, but punishment overall, all punitive apparatuses. So I am an abolitionist as a partner in my marriage. I'm an abolitionist as a parent to my children. I'm an abolitionist as a preacher, as a professional. It informs everything I do. And that means that my response is always looking for an alternative to punishment. In my children's school, for example, they still have the detention system, right? I don't think a detention model should be in an educational institution because that does not create safety. And punishment doesn't build character, right? So when we punish people, it doesn't really change the behavior of people. It doesn't heal. And abolition is a call to healing. It's a call to transformation. It's a call to accountability. And I believe we do that by really encompassing and embodying and applying those 5 virtues: compassion, creativity, care, courage, and community, so that we're moving away from the vices that reinforce the carceral state, right? Condemnation, complicity, individualism, punishment, and so forth. And so the ultimate goal, again, is to restore harms, right? How do we minimize harms, both for the people who caused harm and those who experienced the harm? So there's this restorative element, and how do we repair, right? Whether it's and that reparation shouldn't look like punishment, but accountability. So is it restitution? Is it treatment? So how do we repair those harms, and then how do we rebuild? How do we imagine and create something new?
Yeah, what really stuck out to me was the when you talked about being an abolition in every role, abolitionist. And so I think the C that is probably the hardest for most people is that creativity piece, because it's
Mm.
in some ways easier to be punitive, but it takes work and intentionality. Like, I'm even thinking about, like, if my child does something, like, and having to stop and say, okay, what's the alternative response here?
I
It's going to take time and energy, right? Or with my husband, like, whoever it is. And
Mhm.
so I'm just thinking about how often we probably rely on things because they take less work. They take less energy from us.
That's exactly it. We're so
So
conditioned. Hello?
go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know that you were still speaking, but you're exactly right, right? Punishment is easy because we're so conditioned to think that way. And so, how do we recondition ourselves to flex new muscles so that we're no longer relying on punishment as a first response or a viable response, but we're creative in imagining alternatives? And so, when you talked about your children, I'm thinking about I had one day my son and my daughter were arguing upstairs, and I heard him say, Janae, Dr. Janae, I heard him say, I hate you. And I just couldn't imagine hearing those words in my home, especially as an abolitionist, right? So I summoned them downstairs, and I wanted to meet rage with rage, because that's how, the parenting I was, had
Mhm.
growing up, right? That there was this authoritarian disciplinarian figure, um, who exerted power. And so it's like, I wanted to scream back at him, don't you dare say that. Some parents believe in hitting, right? That the violence that kind of parallels punitive responses. But rather than act on an impulse with those types of negative responses, I said to him, if this isn't, you aren't building your sister up, right? This is, you have caused harm, and because your harm is associated with hate, how do we repair that harm, right? How do we reduce that harm? How do we repair that harm? So, since you mentioned hate, then for the rest of the day, right, I could have said no devices. I could have said go to a corner and have a timeout, right? I could have said all of these things, but instead, to meet that harm of hate, I said for the rest of the day, you have to show your sister acts of love, right? So
Wow.
that is, for me, the abolitionist response. It took creativity, it took compassion, it took all of those virtues to think about how we could repair, restore, and rebuild. And that rebuilding is not just more just and equitable systems, but for our home, it was a more just and equitable and loving family, right? And
Mhm.
so for a 9-year old, showing acts of love to your little sister might feel punitive, right? But in fact, it's building character
Right.
and it's accountable.
And so how would you say our faith plays into all of this? Or how does faith play into this conversation, maybe in general and then for you personally?
Yeah, so I grew up in the church. I had a very faith filled, religious, Black evangelical mother. And so I am a daughter of the church. And so faith is very important to me from that lens. And then also as a theologian, with my academic training, faith is central to the way I think about the experiences of Black people, the ways in which I critique the world, and also construct solutions and interventions. So faith is central to a central lens to my analyses. And when you apply faith to abolition, I feel that it's something that we do not see figure prominently in kind of the national discourse of abolition. Abolition, though it has faith roots, has really gained momentum within the secular or the larger society on the streets, right? And I don't want to build the false dichotomy between sacred and secular, the streets and the church. I think they can coexist, and you certainly had people of faith in the streets of Ferguson and so forth. But what I'm challenging or really helping and training people to think is how can we apply our religious values, our faith beliefs to our understandings of abolition in ways that challenges the church to move away from their complicity and their cooperation in the carceral state in order to create and imagine new alternatives that amasses political power and results in transformative change that dismantles the carceral state. And so for me, when you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, Jesus was very much on the side of liberation, right? God is a God of the oppressed, that God acts in solidarity with the least of these. And so if we look at, so let me just say that abolition is a lifestyle for me. I said that it's an ethic, but I also see it as my religion, right? Because if I serve a God of liberation and abolition is liberation, and if I follow Jesus as, as a disciple of Jesus who came to set the captives free, then as a disciple, I am to extend that ministry of liberation, which is abolition. Okay, so Jesus's life and ministry. When we look at Luke 4:18, when Jesus reads from the scrolls of Isaiah and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me; He has called me to preach good news to the poor," and in that He says, "He's called me to set the captives free." So we see that very central to Jesus's kind of mission statement for His ministry was this focus on liberation and abolition, setting the captives free. We also see within Jesus's call to discipleship in Matthew 25, when He says, "As often as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it for me." And in that He says, "Have you that you visited those who are in prison?" So we could see that Jesus is calling us to be in relationship with those who are in prison, right? And then when you look at Jesus's life, the ways in which He was criminalized as seditious, right, by the Roman Empire and died a criminal's death and hanged between two thieves, we could see that Jesus was in close proximity with criminality. And also, if you were to look at the incarnation through an abolitionist lens, God broke into history through a criminalized body, which is Jesus, right? Jesus, who is Black, Jesus, who is the Black Messiah, Jesus, who is a brown Palestinian Jew. And even the first Christian community, right? You look at Paul and Silas and so forth, possessed a criminal element. So there's no way for us to engage our faith and not see the connection between Jesus and God and the church to those who are criminalized and incarcerated, and be compelled to extend the life and ministry of Jesus by fighting for the dismantling of the carceral state, the same way in which Jesus overcame criminality on the cross. He died a criminal on Good Friday, but on Resurrection Sunday, He arose as the Messiah, right? So He
Wow.
transcended criminality on the cross. And before the resurrection, He extends salvation to the penitent thief. And to do that, He had to see the image of God, the imago Dei, in that person, right? He didn't see them the way the world saw that person as a criminal, but He saw the restorative qualities of that person being transformed and saved and entering into paradise. So faith is absolutely centered to the way in which I see and engage abolition.
So, what do you think? So, okay, like from my lens with mental health, right? And I often see examples in the Bible where people express their emotions and they struggled with mental health. They were human, but sometimes when I am trying to work with churches or more specifically work with pastors, there is resistance to the conversation about mental health, right? So if we have all these examples that you talked about in the Bible of abolition and liberation, What then is the cause or the source of some of the resistance that I imagine? I'm assuming that you get sometimes to this conversation, or that this conversation is not more integrated in the way we do church, or the way we do the way we express our faith in organized ways.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And my organization, Abolitionist Sanctuary, is really purposed to training faith leaders and faith communities of how to engage their faith in liberative ways that does not stigmatize people for their mental health conditions, for being women, for their sexual orientation, but that we find liberative ways to engage our faith that affirms all of God's creation as good and made in the image of God. And so, if there's any of your listeners who are wrestling with that within their own sanctuaries and their own churches, please feel free to connect with me. But in response to your question, it is because we bring a lens, right, a hermeneutic, a way of interpreting the scripture to our faith congregations, to our churches. And it's often influenced by our own biases, whether it's patriarchy,
Mhm.
anti-Black racism, and even, just literal conservative understandings of who God is. And so some people will read texts of, Jesus who heals the woman who was possessed with the spirit and performs an exorcism. And they read that and they say, well, that woman was overcome by a demonic spirit. And because that woman was overcome with a demonic spirit, then that woman must be demonic. And if that woman is demonic, then all women are demonic, right? Those are the type of leaps that
Mhm.
some people
Right.
make, and that does a disservice to how we see God's creation. And so there's a lot of leaps there that aren't scripturally supported, right? But are in fact perpetuated by our own social biases and contexts. So it's a disservice. And I'm going to say how that plays out in the carceral state. There are many people who die to police violence because they're having a mental health crisis. And I'm thinking of a Black woman in particular here, I believe in California, named Michelle Shirley. And I believe Corinne Gaines was also having a mental crisis. But it's this idea that you call the police for help when you see someone in a mental crisis and the police come, and all of these social perceptions run through their heads, right? And their biases of Black bodies as dangerous and as a threat. And so rather than seeing the humanity of that person and worthy of their help, they instead see them as a threat and as a dangerous body and exerts violence, right?
Mm.
That results in fatality unjustly. And so if we recondition the way we see Black bodies, particularly Black women, not as demonic, right? And we could see the tracing that if our social perception of Black women are demonic and we're teaching that in the church, then the church has some responsibility, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so it's really shifting our theologies, but also shifting our social imagination. And then finally, I'll just one last thing. The abolitionist intervention is that we should not be calling the police to respond to mental health crises, right? That we should be responding with community resources. And so you see in the city of Philadelphia and other states around the country that they're now providing new numbers to call when there's a mental health crisis. So you no longer call 911, but you call a number that will dispatch community resources and mental health professionals to de escalate and respond to that situation and not criminalize it.
And I think that's so important. And I think they were moving to also have a national number, a federal number, where so that it would be applicable to everywhere. Because it's so important to think about. I say this about. I mean, I hope I'm not going on a tangent, but when I talk to school counselors or when I talk to teachers, I say if you have a student in your class and you label them as a behavioral problem. There's a different set of resources that is dispatched versus if you say this student is depressed or anxious, right? You have a different set of resources or responses that you then enact, which leads to different implications and consequences. And so I think it's so important if we're able to, first of all, see people as human, right? First, and then we're better able to respond with the correct resources. I think it's going to be transformative both on a micro and a macro level. So I'm really, really glad that you talked about that.
Yeah, that's
And I always think the church can be leaders in so many areas, particularly the Black church. I put a lot of responsibility on them in a lot of ways, but I think it's because with power comes responsibility, and so there's a lot of power that rests in Black churches, and particularly with Black pastors, and so being able to use that power for good is very, very important.
absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about mental health and emotional health, and I want to kind of get the conversation back a little bit more specifically to Black women. I think because I've seen you talked about tenure. One of the things that I noticed as I got closer to tenure is that my research got more personal and it got closer to me. And so I started unpacking ways in which Black women experience the world and how we experience emotions and relationships and all of that stuff, and religion and spirituality. And so one of the things I really love about the work that you're doing is the way you centralize Black women. I mean, you talked about being a woman, and so I can imagine that influences that. And so as
Mhm.
you think about Black women, how does Black women's mental and emotional health play into this conversation? What role does that have?
Black women's mental and emotional health. Part of being an abolitionist is advocating for the wholeness of people, for human flourishing, for people to thrive. And so, through my organization, Abolitionist Sanctuary, we focus specifically on the thriving and the flourishing and wholeness of poor Black mothers. And the abolitionist response to that is, as I mentioned earlier, isn't just tearing down, right? It's not just tearing down prisons, but it's building something new. And so, in order for Black women's emotional and mental health to be whole and to flourish and to thrive, then, according to an abolitionist response, we have to rebuild new systems. And that means we have to not just dismantle prisons, but we have to dismantle poverty, right? And
Mm,
so, if Black women make 60 cents to the dollar of their white male counterparts, that is an inequity that has to be fixed, right? It has to be
mhm,
reckoned with and repaired. And remember, abolition is to repair, restore, and rebuild. So we have to repair that harm of inequities, because if poor Black mothers have to steal milk and food in order to feed their babies because of pay inequities and wealth
mhm,
gaps and economic disparities, then we have to fix those systems, right? That's how we find a solution. It's not in criminalizing that poor mother for just trying to feed her children and sending her to prison. It's making sure that she has access to the basic necessities that she needs for them to survive. And in order for her to have access, then we have to have more just and equitable systems, which means making sure that there isn't these economic disparities, right? Making sure that there's healthcare, that there's quality schools. There's a case that has been popularized about Kelly Williams Bolar and Tanya McDowell, who sent their children to another school district in order to receive a better education,
yeah,
and were convicted and sent to prison, right? That shouldn't be a crime. The crime is that we have separate
right,
and equal schools, right? The crime is that there are better schools in other zip codes than in their own, right? So the crime is the system. And so, if we're going to ensure that Black women and mothers have emotional and spiritual well being, then we have to ensure that there's a system in which they can thrive. And that system does not see them as inferior or unworthy of the resources they need to be treated equally, fairly, and justly.
I think about that when we think about treating Black women in counseling, right? And so I can treat the symptom, which may be depression or anxiety, but how about we respond to the system that is creating that, right? And so, yeah, it's my responsibility to try to alleviate those symptoms and help people manage anxiety and help people move through depression. But if there's a system that is causing this, then we have to respond, or we have to, in your words, repair and restore and rebuild the system. Because if not, we're just going to keep seeing things like this happen as a result of the system.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it, sis.
Yes, 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 yes. And I was as we've been talking, and I try to keep these not short, but to about 30 minutes. I saw a clip of you posting a sermon that you preached not too long ago. And the question that stood out to me in the clip was, where is God? And so, even as we're thinking about this conversation, we're thinking about the ways in which, in particular, Black women have to navigate society. We're mothers, so we're thinking about the school shooting. We're thinking about the ways in which, even just thinking about the shortage of milk formula, like things like this are happening, right?
Mhm.
And so, I want to pull on your theology a little bit. I want to pull on your preacher hat a little bit and say, where is God? Like, I want to ask you that question, like, where is God in all of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's not a new question, right? It's a question that has been asked throughout time, and a question that surfaces particularly around the issue of theodicy and suffering, right? The idea that if God is all powerful, then how could God allow for bad things to happen to good people, right? Why does evil and suffering exist? And when we saw the things happen in our country around gun violence, right? We saw our elders, Black mothers, grandmothers, community people killed by a white supremacist terrorist while they were shopping, right? Doing their grocery shopping. And then in Uvalde, Texas, we saw um, elementary school teachers, I mean, sorry, elementary school teachers and students gunned down by a person, a 18-year-old boy, right? And so these are, and then if we go back to Emmanuel 9, you see people who were killed while worshiping, while welcoming a stranger into their Bible study. And these are the places that should be the safest, right? Church, school, your local supermarket. And it begs the question, right? How can God allow for innocent babies to die? Right?
Mhm.
How do we find the question, where is God? And so these types of events that happen, really shook my faith again. And I think within our faith journeys, we're always wrestling, and we find these momentary moments of resolution where we feel like we have enough to be resolved in that dilemma for that moment in time. And then something else happens that disrupts your faith or rocks you a bit. So that sermon that I preached was actually a sermon about. I'm sorry. So that sermon I preached was a sermon I preached for a church in Santa Monica, and I can't remember the name of it actually. But it was wrestling with these national events and asking, where is God? And it really was sparked by a clergy colleague, Reverend Naomi. Um, Reverend Naomi Leapart. I'm forgetting her full name, and she asked the question on Facebook. She asked the question, "Is God able?" And she had
Wow.
over maybe 300 comments of people wrestling with this question of theodicy, of is God able? And her conclusion was, maybe God isn't, right? Because if God was able, he wouldn't allow this to happen. At some point, he would intervene. And so I'm just really wrestling with that of how I view God. Her name is Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart. And I really wrestled with that. So to the question, where is God in the carceral state? Where is God where the Century Park Five, these five, young boys could be coerced into a false testimony and spend nearly 20 years in prison? Where is God, right? Where is God where the Supreme Court is leaking a decision to gut Roe v. Wade? Where is God? Where is God with, where people in Flint, Michigan still don't have access to clean water? Where is God in Uvalde,
Mhm.
Texas, where parents had to identify their children rather than picking them up after, dismissal and to talk about their day and have dinner? They had to instead go to the school to identify them and later in that week bury their children. Like, where is God? It's a question that I still have. And as I was talking to a colleague this week with this question, because I'm still wrestling, and she said to me that God is in our suffering, right?
Mm.
That God isn't, this superhero that we think is supposed to, fly in with a cape and just shoof all the, the enemies, right? That there is
Mhm.
salvation in knowing that we do not have to suffer alone, right?
Mm.
That God is with us during these crises. God has not abandoned us. And so that's what I'm holding on to. That's the good news for me. That yes, awful things are happening, but in the midst of our suffering, that God is still with us, that God has not abandoned us, that as we suffer, God is weeping too. And that we have some agency, right, to correct course as we're talking about on this national discourse about gun control laws. Let's do better than moving the age limit from 18 to 21. That's part of it. But as you said, there's the larger system that needs to be fixed, right? So let's address those systemic injustices so that no more bodies have to die unjustly and prematurely because of our evils. And remembering that God is with us, Emmanuel, God dwells with us. And so that for me is where I am holding on to the question, where is God? God is with us.
Mm. Oh, I love that. And I try to give people when they come and they are seeking like relief from the impact of suffering. So whether that be, relief from depression or anxiety or whatever it is, I try to encourage them that they can ask the hard questions. And in some ways, there's a freedom in sitting in the tension. Like, I think we create more anxiety, we create more depression when we don't allow ourselves to sit in that tension of, well, where is God? Well, I don't know. Like, how do I feel about this? Is he able? Like, the ability to ask those questions is actually good for our mental health. If that makes sense. I think I've seen a lot of people try to avoid those conversations and it actually creates more tension. But when you're able to sit in that and say, like, I don't have all the answers, I'm struggling, and then get to that place of, hey, I may not have all the answers, but at the end of the day, I'm God is with me in this. He's with me in the questions. He's with me like sitting with this. I just appreciate that. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. That's really really good. I agree. Whether we're sitting with depression, we're sitting with a bad diagnosis from our doctor, sitting with an employment decision of someone's fired. Where is God? God is right there, weeping with you. Right? God is
mhm.
there, and God is that constant companion, that constant friend.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have one more question. It's the question that I'm trying to end on with all my guests because the title of the podcast is Peace is Power. And it just kind of came from me trying to think about how do I maintain peace in life? Not that everything is perfect, not that I have all the answers, but what does it look like for me to have peace like internally? And so I asked all my guests, what does peace mean to you?
You said you ask all your guests, what is peace to me?
What does peace mean to you?
What does peace mean to me?
Mm-hmm.
I also want to emphasize, what you just said is asking the tough questions, right? Peace for me is knowing that I don't have to operate in fear. I don't have to cower. I don't have to be afraid, but that I can trust that God could handle the most difficult questions that I bring, even if it's, where is God? Have you abandoned us in our time of suffering? Because I preached a sermon that said there's a difference between doubting and an inquiring faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so an inquiring faith asks the question differently. And we saw this particularly in the passage in Luke where we see the nativity narratives, the birth narratives between Elizabeth and Mary before the Magnificat. But basically, the question isn't, God, um, God, why is this happening to me? You won't heal my body. The right question with inquiring faith is, God, I know you are a healer, but when will you heal my body? Right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's acknowledging who God is, right? Your question doesn't diminish who God is, right? But you can still ask, God, I know you are a mind regulator, but when will the
Right.
voices go away?
Yes. Yes.
And so for me, what brings me peace is being able to bring all of my questions, all of my joys, all of my fears, all of my burdens, all of my celebrations, all of me to God. And in God, see that I am still good, that I am still God's creation, and that I am still destined to be more than a conqueror and to achieve what God has assigned for me, right? And so it's this absolute relationship with God that understands that what's for me is for me. I don't need to compete with others. I don't need to envy others. I don't need to wish that what someone else has is mine. I don't need to be afraid to ask questions. I could bring all of that to God because at the end of the day, I know that my story is written, right? And that's what gives me peace.
I love that. And I think that is the perfect place to end. I probably need to go to my prayer closet and cry after that. So we gonna wrap this up. But no, I just really appreciate you, Dr. Nikia. Thank you for sharing. How can people get in contact with you if they want to learn more about what the work that you're doing and the Abolitionist Sanctuary?
Thank you so much for having me.
How can people get in contact with you if they want to learn more
I'm
about
so
what the work that you're doing?
I'm so glad you asked. As I mentioned, I'm the executive director of Abolitionist Sanctuary. If you would like to sign up for our email list or to give to support a faith-based abolitionist movement, you can visit www.abolitionistsanctuary.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Abolitionist Sanctuary. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Abolitionist Sanctuary, and also at Dr. Nikia S. Robert.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sis. God bless you.
Y'all, I told you we was going to class today. Oh my God. What an amazing learning experience we had. But we also went to church. Not only did we go to class, we went to church. So I'm so grateful for Reverend Dr. Nikia Robert, who came and who shared with us on this podcast. And as I think about moving towards peace, I think I'm going to be sitting with the question and the answer that she gave to where is God. And so as we think about our spiritual journey, thinking about it's okay to sit in the tension, it's okay to sit with the questions. And sometimes peace means sitting with the hard questions. It means wrestling with things that we don't quite understand. It means being okay with not having all the answers. So that's where I am. That's what I'm going to take for the next week. I hope you will continue to join us. This is the Pieces Power Podcast. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you follow the show. Make sure you rate the show. Also, visit me on social media at Dr. Aiden Harris on Instagram and Twitter, Dr. Janae Aiden Harris on Facebook, and check out my website, www.draidenharris.com. All right, y'all. Till next time, peace is power. Peace out.